Welcome back to the Beyond Sunday School podcast. Appreciate you taking the time to be here with us this morning as we start season 3. We're going to have a structure throughout this season of looking at the book of Ecclesiastes. From now on, we're going to structure our seasons in ways that we're going through books of the Bible. That way we're getting the most out of it. It's good to be structured, I think, and I think that'll really translate to a good season of podcast episodes going through the book of Ecclesiastes, a book that I've long wanted to teach, but just never. We've been going through the minor prophets at Shively and teaching on different things and never really got around to teaching this book. Because to me, this book is a very interesting book that answers an important question, which is really our theme for this season is, why am I here? You know, we experience so many different things in life. We ask the question, why? Why does this happen? Why do I experience this? What's going on? And Solomon goes throughout this book, and he's going to answer this question of why. Why are we here? What's the purpose of us being here on this earth? We're going to go through the first 11 verses of chapter 1 today for episode 1, which is titled Crisis. You know, every person, it's been said, goes through a midlife crisis where you kind of question everything and you're kind of spontaneous and you do different stuff that you normally wouldn't do. And I think all of us have gone through a period of time in our lives where we've questioned, you know, why we're here, what's the meaning of life, what's the purpose of life. And to me, I think it's okay to question and to ask questions. I don't think God condemns us at all for being curious and wanting to know more. You know, Solomon went about finding this answer the wrong way, but we can learn from him throughout his various experiences that he, you know, partook in and did, that a lot of these things don't amount to anything. They don't fulfill the promise that's given to us. But that if we'll truly seek out our purpose and truly seek out our reasoning for being here, I think we will be a whole lot more secure in our purpose here. So the first thing we're going to discuss before you can even get into the book and really discuss, you know, kind of the meat of the letter, I'm going to talk about the purpose of this book. Just like many of the books of the Bible, the writer identifies himself in verse 1. It says, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. So this book is a book that is very negative. It's hopeless in a lot of ways, the way it's written. There is no praise in the book. There is no sign of peace really throughout the book either. And Solomon, in all reality, promotes really unquestionable conduct with the way that he lives. But this book means so much because it shows us really just how fragile life is and just how foolish it is to trust in life rather than trusting in God. This book lacks an eternal perspective. And you're going to see that throughout when we go through and read. Before we go into verse 2, I want to point out one more thing. This identification of the king in Jerusalem. Solomon has wisdom that he asks from God. He has freedom to write this book. He has resources to partake in these experiments. And he has the influence that people are going to listen to what he says. So this is a very influential person who has a lot of life experiences, but also asks God for wisdom. So this is a book that the actions are foolish, but a lot of the text that we're going to study is actually wise. In verse 2, it says, vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. A simple way to understand this, you know, vanity is not a word that we typically use. Oh, all is vanity. All is worthless, useless, meaningless. That's really what vanity means. And this is his first conclusion that he comes to, and he's going to use this phrasing a lot throughout the book. Looking at life all around, he judges life to be meaningless, nothing, you know, useless. But then he goes a step further, not only life, but then he says everything is meaningless, useless, worthless. And that in and of itself, you would think, this is a man that has wisdom from God. This is a man whose father had a heart, he was a man after God's own heart. Solomon builds the temple. There's a lot of good things Solomon does. Well, why would you come to the conclusion that life is worthless, useless, meaningless, and that everything is worthless, useless, and meaningless? Well, Solomon strays from God. He lives a life that's not pleasing to God, and that's why he comes to this conclusion. This is not written from an eternal perspective. And we shouldn't view life as meaningless, useless, or worthless, because God wouldn't give you something worthless or useless or meaningless. He wouldn't give you that. Our lives can be very worthwhile. They can be very useful. They can be very meaningful if we're living with that eternal perspective. But Solomon isn't, so that's why he comes to the conclusion that everything is worthless or useless. He asks a question in verse 3, what profit has a man from all of his labors in which he toils under the sun? Life is filled with labors. The scriptures command us to work. They command us to provide for our families. We're supposed to work, but what's it worth? What does it profit? He uses a phrase at the very end that he's going to use a lot, under the sun. The idea of this is not on a sunny day or something to have to do with weather. The idea is simply this: in this world that we can see, the material world, that's what he's talking about. It is life considered without an eternal perspective. Under the sun is temporary, material, physical world. That phrase, under the sun, you'll see this repeatedly throughout the book. It's listed 25 separate times throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. So he's talking a lot about the physical, a lot about the material. So he does bring up a good question: what profit has a man from all of his labor in which he toils under the sun? What do those profits do outside of the physical life? Nothing. When you get to the spiritual, the profits of this physical labor is not going to matter. It goes back to the question Jesus asked in Mark chapter 8 verse 36, for what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? So when you get to this verse and compare it to Ecclesiastes chapter 1 verse 3, Solomon's on to something. He's thinking of it from a physical perspective, but Jesus also backs this up and says you can gain all this material blessing, all these profits, but in the eternal perspective, it's meaningless. And Solomon comes to that conclusion too. Okay, well, what happens after under the sun? What does this do after this life? And that's something we need to understand and put into the forefront of our minds. No matter what we profit in this world, even gaining everything, it won't amount to anything if you lose your own soul. Solomon was concerned about the physical here. He wasn't concerned about his soul. Jesus turns it around, and his whole concern was about the soul, the spiritual condition, the eternal state that we will be in literally for eternity. And that's the purpose of Ecclesiastes. It's to ask the question, what happens after under the sun? What happens after the physical? Well, why are these physical blessings not giving us the fulfillment and joy that they promise? And that's what we're going to get into and discuss throughout this podcast. So it brings up another interesting aspect of the first 11 verses. And Solomon touches on an unending cycle of creation. When you get to verses 4 and 5, it says, one generation passes away, and another generation comes, but the earth abides forever. The sun also rises, and the sun goes down and hastens to the place where it arose. Using several examples here, Solomon observes that nothing seems to change very much in the seemingly unending cycle of nature. One generation passes away, another generation comes. Okay, they just replace the generation before them. Verse 5 leads into verses 6 and 7, where Solomon says, the wind goes towards the south and turns around to the north, and the wind whirls about continually, and it comes again on its circuit. All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place from which the rivers come, there they return again. Solomon could observe under the sun in the physical the unchanging cycles expressed the unchanging monotony of life, leading to its vanity and meaningless. these unchanging cycles. Why won't they change? Why won't things be different? Why do things work the way that they do? In the physical aspect, it's meaningless, it's worthless, it's useless. For the child of God, everything has meaning, everything has use, and everything has worth. So, you're seeing this idea is contradictory to what we believe. Weather works the way it does for a reason. God intends that. God uses that for a purpose, for a reasoning. Solomon says, what's the purpose of these things? I witness this from a physical perspective. It doesn't make sense to me. It's meaningless. It's worthless. It's useless. So you go from creation, you go from weather to an unending cycle of work. Now this is the one where we may find ourselves in today. In verses 8 and 9, it says, all things are full of labor. Man cannot express it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. That which has been is what will be, and that which is done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. Solomon observes that the meaninglessness of life wasn't only reflected in nature. His frustration is also expressed in human effort and endeavoring to do something great. Despite all of man's labor, despite him being able to see and hear, he will still not be satisfied. And that's true. That which has been done is what will be. That which is done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. Despite all of man's work and progress, life seems continually the same. Things that seem new get old quickly. So it could be said there's nothing new under the sun. It's same old, right? The new thing becomes the old thing, like a car. Oh, new car, and it becomes, just your car. That's just the way we view life. Every day is a new opportunity, but for many people, they view today the same way they viewed yesterday, and they'll view tomorrow the same way they view today. And it's always, it's just, it's tomorrow, it's yesterday, it's whatever. It's a new opportunity, to labor, to work, to be able to see, to be able to hear. These are blessings from God. We're commanded to work. In fact, we're commanded to listen. We're commanded to keep our eyes in the right place, to seek out God in all that we do. These are all blessings that, we take for granted, that don't satisfy us because you've always been able to see, you've always been able to hear. Maybe you've always had the physical ability to take care of yourself and to work. That's a lot of times what we do. And life just becomes old and mundane and meaningless. But as a follower of Christ, life is filled with a lot of new things. The scriptures use the word new a lot. They go kind of against what Solomon says. Just want to show you a few verses, and I'll even keep this up for you for just a minute as I talk through it, in case you want to jot these down. As a follower of Jesus, life is filled with new things. We get a new name, Isaiah 62 at verse 2, Revelation chapter 2 at verse 17. We're no longer a sinner, we're a Christian. A new community, Ephesians chapter 2 at verse 14. It's no longer you're living your life by yourself, you're living it with a community known as a congregation or a church. A new commandment. We're not living by our old ways of thought. We're living by a new commandment that Jesus gave us over in John chapter 13 at verse 34. We're living by a new covenant, Jeremiah 31 at verse 33 and Matthew chapter 26 at verse 28. We a lot of times complain about what God wants us to do and how God wants us to live. Well, the old covenant is a whole lot worse than the new covenant. The new covenant is better. It's better because of the author of it. It's better because it's a better way for us. A new and living way to heaven, Hebrews chapter 10 at verse 20. It's no longer because of the blood of bulls and goats. We don't have to offer the animal sacrifices that used to be offered in the old covenant, the Old Testament. Instead, we have Christ, who gives us a new hope, who gives us new things, a new creation in Jesus, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 17. You don't have to be defined by who you used to be and what you used to do in your old habits. Those don't have to be the things that define you any longer. And then 2 Corinthians 5:17 and Revelation chapter 21 and verse 5, all things become new. You know, Christ can take a terrible, mundane, awful life and make it good. He can make it new. We can be refreshed as children of God. And for many people, when they're looking at life, that's exactly what they want. They want a what? A new and fresh start. Well, you can start out with a new name, a Christian. You can start out with a new community, a new family, the church. You can start out with a new commandment that's easier to follow. You know, you can start out with a new covenant that is designed to help you get to heaven, a new and living way to provide that way for us, the example of being Christ. A new opportunity to change yourself, to be something better. Scriptures teach all things become new with God's help because of what Christ has done for us. And it brings up then the concluding verses for our episode today, verses 10 and 11. Is there anything of which it may be said, see, this is new, has already been in ancient times before us, there is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of things that are to come by those who will come after. The futility of life seems to extend in both directions, both into the past and into the future. Man works hard, yet it never seems to make a lasting difference, and all is simply forgotten. When you consider the generations before you, ask yourself this question: how many generations do you know of, and do you know their names? Do you know their occupations? Do you know the impact that they made? Solomon does make a decent point here. Because in the physical aspect, yes, that's true. But also when you turn it on the opposite side, look at the other side of the coin, generations do make impacts. That I know of, I'm a fourth generation Christian. That's an impact from my great-grandparents, my grandparents, my parents, me. Hopefully, mine and Kate's children will be fifth-generation Christians, and it'll continue to pass down and pass down and pass down. When those things are passed down, we remember them. This is looking at a physical perspective, but through the eternal scope, through the eternal lens, you can pass something down that's meaningful and useful. And it is lasting. It won't be forgotten because we remember it. We put it first by those that have come before us and set the ultimate example. It's important that we do that. But that's the big takeaway from this. If you're viewing things all through a physical and temporal scope, you're going to be disappointed just like Solomon. But if you're viewing things through the eternal scope of making sure we're doing the things we ought to do, then we're going to view these things as an opportunity to grow and a blessing from God. So, how are you viewing your crisis today? Is it something to panic? Is it something to run away from God? Is it something that we try a bunch of different stuff instead of sticking with God and sticking with His commandments and sticking for His purpose for us? You know, those are questions that we can only answer for ourselves. But I hope through these first 11 verses, we're laying a good groundwork that we can find our purpose, find our meaning for being here on this earth. We appreciate you taking the time to join us today. As always, this podcast would not be possible without the work that's done at the Chauvet Church of Christ, our members. To me, it gives me a lot of motivation to do these ventures, and we appreciate everybody at church that helps with that, encourages it, and watches it, and shares it. If you want to find some sermons about the meaning and purpose of your life, all of my lessons are over on our Facebook page for the last 3 years. If you're looking for something, hopefully they're of benefit and help. And then also, you can find us on YouTube at Chauvet Church of Christ. We have all of our classes and lessons since last March on there, if you want to go over there and find them. And also, these podcast episodes will be posted on both of those sites as well, as long as also on our page here. So we appreciate you taking the time to be here today. I hope that this has been a blessing to you. I hope that it's been helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to let me know and share those with me. But we appreciate so much you taking the time to watch this. Be on the lookout for our pulpit preview tomorrow morning. And then also, we hope that you'll join us for Worship Sunday. So once again, thank you so much for your time. Hope this was a blessing to you. Have a great beginning of your day. And we look forward to seeing you for episode 2 next week.